So, Happy New Year and welcome everybody. This is the January 2024 Indicators of Behavior Project meeting. I am your chair and host, Charlie Frick from Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. Very glad to have everybody here today. And what I thought I'd start off with is let us kind of dive into our technical talk. We're very lucky to have Mr. Carter Bullard from Quotient here. And we shall have a beautiful talk on that, followed by some updates on some of our current research on indicator of behavior prototypes, talk a little bit about our cooperation with the CASP project, and then kind of open the floor for general discussion. So, and I'll just give a quick note to Jane, who unfortunately isn't getting audio. But regardless, I thought we'd kick things off the new year with a fun technical talk, operationalizing IOB from Carter Bullard of Quotient.
Yeah, I don't know how, I hope this is going to be interesting. So this is a first shot draft at trying to describe what you need to do in order to make IOBs work for you. And so I found that in doing this, there's too much to put in. So I'm hoping that because this is a small group and a friendly crowd, that we can talk about this as a starter sort of development presentation and looking for lots of comments on how we can make it better. So let me share my screen. And Charlie, I'm terrible at looking at the chat channel and all that kind of stuff.
I will keep eager eyes on the chat and let you know if we have any questions coming in.
Great. So I operationalize. Oh, yeah, let's go ahead and just get started. So this is the title, Indicators of Behavior, Operationalizing IOBs. I'm going to talk about zero trust and I have justifications for that in the presentation. So that'll just be the title.
And just in case you're on, just checking real quick, Carter, not a big deal, but if you're on multiple screens, we're seeing the main PowerPoint window, not a presentation window.
Is that all right? Because if I put it in presentation mode, it's going to make my screen get big and then I can't see anything else.
Not a big deal. I just wanted to let you know in case you had another monitor going, because that happens to some folks.
No, but you can see the slides, right?
We absolutely can.
Okay, good. So IOBs, next generation threat intelligence. That seems reasonable, right? That's what we'd like for it to be. And the entire industry, cyber industry, wants behavioral methods to be the next step in improving threat detection, analysis, planning, response, and recovery. That there is no doubt that if Gartner says that behavioral methods are going to do it, then that's what's going to happen, right? But the cyber operating universe has become a horribly complex beast to deal with. So EDR, NDR, XDR, next generation firewalls, all of these things are now an important part of any decision that you make in terms of adding new capabilities to a cybersecurity solution for a large enterprise. So we're not just going to be able to just throw an IOB event into the mix and assume it's going to be successful in any way. We have to design a solution such that it makes sense for introducing an IOB into this whole mix. And it is all going to be dependent on having a success story associated with it. Now, if anybody disagrees with any stuff, raise your hand. Let's talk about it. And but I think these are reasonable statements so far. Now, my research for this presentation, I ran into this paper from, I apologize that I cannot pronounce these names very well, but this is a group from Spain that has presented a paper in electronics on key requirements for the detection and sharing of behavioral indicators of compromise. And the reason I like this paper is that it doesn't just talk about formats and indicators of compromise, they actually talk about the structure of threat intelligence, how you formulate threat intelligence, and how you share things, and what are the challenges of doing that with behavioral data. Now, they call it behavioral IOCs. So, and I'm not 100% in agreement with these guys, but at least it gets all the topics down there. So I'd like to just use this paper as a good example of how there's a very large discussion in how to use these sort of new indicators. Now, what are they saying in this paper? They're saying the discussion points that their indicators of compromise have a history, and the behavioral indicators of compromise are going to have to do something slightly different. They introduce this intelligence cycle, which is more of a CISA, cyber threat intelligence services type of problem, which is really important. So, if you can't throw out IOBs without having an understanding of how IOBs are going to be shared and how the threat intelligence is going to be developed around them. They talk about threat specifications, approaches, key requirements, and their conclusions. Their conclusions are to integrate behavioral IOCs into existing infrastructure by focusing on the SIM. And I think that that's a great start, but it's just the first half step down the path. It's just a drop in the bucket. So, what does IOB adoption and integration really mean? Either it fits into an existing cyber architecture or it fits into an emerging cyber architecture. Whichever one it does, it has to have some early wins because it's going to be a big investment. It's going to require possibly new sensors, new analytics, new strategies, extensions to existing cyber capabilities, new TTPs, lots of stuff is going to happen. So you have to have some early wins if it's going to work. Now, I think the DoD Zero Trust architecture is a really good candidate for this concept of how can we integrate IOBs into either an existing or emerging cyber architecture. Now, I think of the Zero Trust architecture the DoD has as an emerging architecture. It's really well documented. It hasn't been deployed, but it has some really good pictures. Much different than CISA, who has a lot of dialogue, not so many pictures. So why do I think behavioral anomaly detection, indicators of behavior, the whole 9 yards? Why do I think Zero Trust architecture is amenable to it? Well, they actually mention behavior in the architecture itself at least 32 times, possibly 60-something times. And they mention hunting 0 times. So hunting right now is a really huge part of existing strategies. And for a new architecture to not even have a single use of the term kind of suggests a change in direction, change in focus. So I think that Zero Trust architecture, especially the US DoD trust architecture, may be the best target for introducing IOBs in a large scale. And I don't think that anybody in this group is working on this type of technology, thinking it's going to be a small little thing on the side. This should be a big deal. So the DoD Zero Trust architecture actually describes transitions between existing technology and existing practices in cyber and its transition to Zero Trust capabilities. And in there, they actually describe specifically how behavioral analytics, behavioral indicators, and behavioral anomalies fit into the architecture. And they involve device hygiene. That's a big deal, by the way, in Zero Trust. Conditional authorization, where they're interested in not only UEBA metrics, but also non-person entity behavioral analytics, NPE analytics, as they call them. Security governance and supply chain, software-defined perimeters. These are not terms that existing security architectures really embrace, but they are an important part of Zero Trust, and they have behavioral components to them. So we can turn, and that's why I mentioned SBOMs a couple of meetings ago, because Zero Trust implies that the supply chain protections have a huge behavioral component to them. And when I see the word behavior, I expect that there could be an indicator of behavior that would be in part of the security protections of that thing. Dynamic policy enforcement, entity and activity auditing, and visibility and analytics. Each one of these capabilities have at least a sentence that describes the need for advanced behavioral methods and more capabilities to support the protection of these pillars, characteristics, or components of their architecture. So I would like to suggest that as we discuss, provide examples, or develop scenarios around operationalizing IOBs, that Zero Trust might be the right architecture for doing that. So Zero Trust defines behavior as in a really strange way, not any way anybody else has described it. They just simply say it's an aggregate data from logs and reports that provides packet flow, file, and other types of information, as well as certain kinds of threat data to figure out whether certain kinds of activity and behavior are likely to constitute a cyber attack. Now, this is lifted right out of the architecture reference documents. All right. I love the fact that it says to figure out. That's a very scientific phrase right there. But they provide references for the definitions, and threat intelligence is very interesting because it has the same word in it, aggregated. Information that has been aggregated, transformed, analyzed, interpreted, or enriched to provide the necessary context for decision-making processes. The use of the word aggregate is not coincidental. It's actually extremely important to how the DoD thinks about the development of threat intelligence and how it actually does many of its existing detections. And so I like to use these things as kind of scoping framing statements as to how behavioral threat intelligence might actually fit into the Zero Trust architecture, right? Obviously, it has to do with data. Obviously, it has to do with aggregated data and transformation and analysis of data. And so it kind of pushes me into a position to think that in order to operationalize IOBs into a Zero Trust architecture, I'm really going to be talking about data more than anything else. And I'll get into that as we get a little bit longer. Any hands up, any questions so far? Pretty simple, straightforward.
Following the chat, people are right there with you.
Okay, so here we go. So this is the Zero Trust architecture, the data model for the Zero Trust architecture. The IOBs, if we just generated a single XML or any kind of sticks type extension that had behavioral data in it, it would have to fit into this data flow model if it's going to fit into a Zero Trust architecture. Now, this looks complicated, looks difficult. It's not, but this is better defined than anything else that I'm seeing in cloud, SASE, CASB, any kind of architecture you think of. They don't get even to this level of descriptions on how does the data flow within the cyber infrastructure, and then what does the system do with the data. So for us to get IOBs into a Zero Trust architecture, most people are going to be thinking about sensors. Can you see my pointer when I put it down here, Charlie?
We do.
So most of the documents, especially the first document that I showed, they don't assume that the sensors are actually going to generate IOBs. They assume that the SIEM is going to collect all this data and they're going to generate an IOB from the SIEM. Now, a lot of people would think that that's a reasonable thing to do, but it doesn't really scale very well. And I'll show you some of the examples in the existing DoD on how it is that centralized SIEMs get overwhelmed because of the level of data that they have to actually process. But as a kind of a data flow sort of architecture, either an IOB generated event is either going to come from the SIM or the SOAR, or it's going to come from the sensors themselves. And when we get down to what the data has to be and how IOBs are going to be developed, we're going to find that it's probably not going to come from the sensors. It's probably going to come from over here in this SIM, SOAR, AI, ML triangle. So if we take out most of the architecture and focus on the specifics that I think are going to be important, some kind of alarms or alerts and log feeds are going to come from the infrastructure and come into some kind of data analytics environment. Most people think it's going to be the SIM and the SOAR, but if you notice over here on the left, there's a behavioral scoring component that's formalized in the zero trust architecture. That's an important part to IOBs, I believe. And if you look over here underneath the AI and the ML part, you get the real essence of what anomaly detection is all about, which is identifying departures from normal conditions. Now, the reason I think that we won't have many specialized sensors for IOBs is this simple component here, this identified departures from normal conditions. How do you do that? You know, where is the data coming from that helps you to understand what normal conditions are? If you think about sensor strategies today in cybersecurity architecture, all they do is generate, hey, I saw something bad. Hey, I saw something bad over here. Hey, something bad over here is happening. Hey, I think something bad is happening over here. That's not normal conditions, and it's not the kind of data that helps you to develop normal concepts. Now, normal concepts and conditions are now being discussed simply as baselines. So because zero trust analytics, AI, threat intelligence, and all kind of stuff is now being focused on departures from normal conditions. And this is a critical part of the architecture, by the way. Threat intelligence interacts with that. RPA, for those who may not know, is called a robotics process automation. All right. So that's just the autonomy part of the cyber autonomy that's being envisioned in zero trust architectures. So this notion of the vendor AI and threat intelligence programs feeding data into this cycle, it really does focus on normal conditions, deviations, and behavioral scoring, which to me is got enough language to be describing IOB analytics. So I think the reason I'm talking about all this stuff is this architecture wants IOBs. They are going to expect the vendors and the components to generate them and process them. So I think that this is the right place to operationalize IOBs at a large scale. So does that mean that we don't talk about SASE and cloud-based stuff and all the little 4-letter or 3-letter acronyms? No, you know, zero trust embodies some of that technology, but zero trust is a much more fundamental concept than CASB with ZTNA and UEBA combined together to form SASE. You know, that so this to me is a really good starting point in terms of trying to figure out how do we make IOBs real. Okay, one of the really big deals in zero trust is dynamic adaptive policy feedback. Now, a lot of people call that active cyber defense. Okay, so I don't know why they moved away from those terms, but the idea is that based on sensing and some kind of analytic, you're going to change the policy and the policy controllers in the infrastructure, possibly in real time. So if you're not familiar with all of these terms on this slide, PEP is just a policy enforcement point. Those are like your firewalls, and just leave it at that, simply next generation firewalls. This entire cycle right here is a big, fast feedback loop where you take sensor information along with saved historical data, you do some aggregation analysis of it, go through some analytics, you identify the need for policy change, and then you continuously update the policy controllers to redefine the policies being enforced in the infrastructure. This is active cyber defense. Does that make sense? Do you jive on that? Does
I
anybody
do.
disagree with that? So, this is a very nice formal way to talk about the kinds of things that many people in the group have been thinking about for a long time. What is important about this slide is that it's back to this component right here, that there is a large amount of historical data available for analytics against real-time instrumentation and sensors of data inside the infrastructure. This is back, if you remember, this is where we were going to get our baselines and where we're going to get the notion of what's normal. Am I still seeing normal? And how I get anomaly detection, emergent behavior and missing behavior. All of that really comes from saved historical data. And that is probably the one enabling component for IOBs that is different than most other cyber approaches. Behavioral analytics and behavioral anomaly detection are heavily dependent on saved historical data. And so it's very difficult to imagine how we can operationalize IOBs without operationalizing IOB data. And I know that the working group isn't talking about the data that is used to generate IOBs, but I think we have to talk about it at some level. And I really think that IOB, the whole approach is really about behavioral data. And that's my perspective on it. That's and I know that a lot of people will disagree with that, but that's just where I'm coming from, that it's really about the data. And the data has to enable an awful, if you're going to be efficient about this with a minimum number of sensors to drive IOB, then you want a data element that's really rich in features so that you can enable a lot of different kinds of behavioral analytics. And so the reason I'm talking about this is that if we're going to be successful with IOBs, we need to have some wins. We need to be able to deploy it and get a reproducible, somewhat quick win from it. And you're not going to get that by just hoping that you throw it out and there'll be a guy doing something in your infrastructure and see, my IOB told me that I had some exfiltration that I didn't see using any other method. That's not going to be a way to make something like IOB successful. It's helpful, but it's not going to be the thing that makes it successful. So we need high value IOB generation if we're going to have reproducible, successful outcomes from the deployment of IOBs. And so it doesn't matter whether the IOBs are generated in the sensor or in the SIM or in AI or in some kind of simple analytic. It just needs to be an IOB that's well recognized and provides high value to the enterprise. It's going to be more than likely a behavioral anomaly detection. So it's going to be based on baselines. So we have to have some baseline generation and management. So back to that third item here, the anomaly detection is based on really saved historical data. And we do want to drive this concept that there are simple behavioral representations that are going to lead to successful IOBs, and that new, anomalous, missing, and normal behavior representations, I think, are going to be really important. But I think if we're going to be successful as a working group and the technology is going to be successful, the group needs to find some examples that help drive the design of the formats, the methods, how threat intelligence might actually work. And I think finding a key example like data exfiltration, lateral movement, covert channels, or some indications of persistence are the kinds of things that we can build reproducible IOBs that are high value and provide almost immediate positive value to any customer that deploys it. There are plenty of data exfiltration schemes that are very difficult to detect. Slow, massive parallel channels, multi-protocol channels. I'm going to send of it with emails. Some of it I'm going to send over some DNS covert channels. Some of it I'm going to send over as padding on the back of HTTPS requests. So those are extremely difficult to see, but there are a lot of behavioral analytics and a lot of saved historical data approaches that can detect those things. And I think that things like sophisticated data exfiltration may be the ticket. Lateral movement detection may be the ticket. Covert channel detection is an easy one, and that is a good one. How many covert channels are being used in nation-state attacks today? Well, not that many. And you don't hear about new covert channels right now. I don't know, the beacons might be considered some kind of covert channel. Persistence is really a good one to be paying attention to, I think. All right, so what's the relevance back to the DoD? Well, the DoD has been doing historical data management for a long time. Centaur Acropolis, if you're not familiar with these terms, is a program where they DISA collects all the flow data that they can generate in key elements in the network, and they store it for a year and a half. And it's available for visualizing any kind of activity, much less cyber activity. And it has been successful. It's an expensive program for the DoD, but it has found some good stuff for them. And so I use this as an example that the DoD is willing to invest in saved historical data, advanced analytics, and next generation event generation around that kind of data, right? But this is the way Centaur and Acropolis are built. These are really DoD-wide data sets. So they are very difficult to work with. They're very large. It takes a lot of effort to make this work for them. But if you were to imagine Centaur on a laptop, where every user access, every network access, every interaction, software interaction has some observable, what's the right word, auditable sort of event stuck on the disk. And then imagine that you can expand that out in a distributed architecture. You can create Centaur-like strategies and drive data stored analytics at a scale that makes sense and is, what's the right term, affordable, both in resources and in cost. So an IOB network data analytic might actually look like we have a special kind of sensor in every component. This diagram just wants to show that, hey, it's going to be complicated and there are lots of data generation, and we probably are going to have to bring all that data to some kind of central audit system in order to do some kind of coordinated analytics. But the big deal is to suggest that mobile assets and fixed assets, if they generate historical data and store it themselves, then the IOB data model may be that it shares baselines rather than historical raw data. But it keeps the raw data and offers APIs for access to that data when needed to do certain types of behavioral analytics. So this is a model that is emerging out of DHS, what's the right word, pilots, and some localized DoD and intelligence community architectures, where the idea is to take the Acropolis Centaur model and scale it down to small working groups or small relationships, and then to provide the same kind of value and the same kind of analytics that something like Centaur and Acropolis could provide. Now, if you're really into this stuff, Centaur and Acropolis are not in danger, but they're not, people don't like it so much because it is massively large and expensive. But And most people think that scaling it down into small work groups or lands or whatever is impractical. But I think that IOB is going to put enough positive utility out of this kind of approach that we're just simply storing historical data on endpoints and then providing access to that data in order to generate IOBs is going to become a reality. So I think this is important to you realize that in massively large architecture, if IOB is going to work, where the behavior is going to be observed, where are they going to be tracked, where are they going to be developed, and it needs to fit into an architecture that either exists or is emerging. And I think zero trust for the DoD at scale is going to be the driving element to make IOBs a working element and a successful element in the cybersecurity for those architectures. All right, so what can you do with the data? This is analysis that I did a long time ago on just simply network classification of all enterprise services just to see how does certain metrics cluster and how do they analyze. And we got a huge benefit from doing this kind of analysis in a DHS pilot a couple of years ago. And the reason I show this is the only way you can do this kind of analysis is by having lots of historical data. And this is simple data. This is just A and B are talking, and here's the number of bytes and in both directions. So this is a very simple metric you can do with any kind of NetFlow data. And there are dozens of vendors that generate the data. You can create this analytic. But you can't generate this analytic without large amounts of historical data. Kind of data that Centaur would use. This kind of analytic that Centaur could generate. But the question is, how can you do that at a scale and a cost? And the idea of putting on each endpoint and then doing this kind of analysis is approachable. Okay, so what about IOB intelligence? And I think that IOB intelligence is really about normalized behavior and normalized behavioral data. And what I mean by normalized, I mean that it's got to be based on stuff without IP addresses, without names, without hashes, because those are the things that are easily obfuscated and mimicked. And so I think the industry assumes that behavioral indicators are indicators that are absent of IP addresses and specific DNS names and specific hashes. So when you start thinking about it, what is CISA going to send to Johns Hopkins as a new behavioral indicator of compromise or an IOB and what is it going to look like? Is it going to be, if you talk to this IP address with this name, you're in trouble? No, we already have those, right? So it should be something like, I have seen an odd behavior from Windows devices to access this address space. I don't know, is that an indicator of behavior? I think so, but some people might think that's just another IOC. If it's, say, I see a host is using port 84 with SSH protocol on it, that sounds like a behavior to me. Protocols are behaviors. So no addresses, no names, no hashes, just here's some relationships and here's some content that give this one away. And I think that to develop a piece of intelligence like that seems complex and difficult, but with enough data, with enough time and enough behavioral anomalies analytics, they can easily be developed so that they don't have addresses and names in them or hashes. And so I think that we should expect those kinds of IOB intelligence elements to be generated. But, it needs to fit. It needs to fit into the MITRE attack framework. It needs to fit into zero trust. So it needs to be focusing on things that are important. And I still think data exfiltration, lateral movement, covert channels, and persistence are the kinds of attack TTPs where behavioral stuff is amenable to detection and for intelligence sharing. So I'm hoping, oh, and I was just going to show, here's some stupid examples of domain name servers. This is what they normally look like, and here's what they look like when they're used as covert channels. And these are values that are measuring how much data is being pushed and how much data is being received. And this is suggesting that in DNS, because you give the name to the server and the server gives you the name and the address back, you are a slight consumer in DNS protocol. You're always going to be getting an answer that's bigger than the request. And if you look at covert channels, that relationship goes away completely to where everything in this particular one right here, this is file transfer over DNS using DNS to TCP tools. It always has this ratio. Now, things like PCR ratios, is PCR a well understood metric that multiple vendors generate? No, it's not. How do we report in an intelligence, from an intelligence organization that, hey, if you see DNS with a PCR of blah, that's going to be difficult to be successful with, because how many, like I said, how many organizations are calculating PCRs? So you have to anticipate the data that these sites are going to have, and then you have to show them how to process that data in order to create these metrics, and then give them some kind of analytic to where they can identify the same scenario that the threat intelligence is dealing with. So, okay, I just threw that out there as just a way of operationalizing IOB intelligence and how difficult it might be or how simple it might be. So, so that's as far as I've gotten so far. So I'm thinking, how do we operationalize IOBs? Yes, it involves standardized formats for data representation exchange, but its success is really dependent on its integration with existing cyber architecture and workflow. And you have to have a win. You have to have a scenario where the IOB is the way to detect this sucker. And I think that there are a handful of examples that we can use as a working group that can highlight, not only can we identify specific scenarios in an enterprise, but it also fits into the intelligence cycle, where we can show how a third party, a government organization, or a private corporation can develop this IOB intelligence and distribute it to consumers that can actually use it to either see that, oh, going forward, I'm looking for this IOB, but because of that saved historical data, I might be able to use the intelligence to look to see if I've ever seen this IOB in the past. And that's a critically important part of, I think, the zero trust architecture, as well as how IOB can contribute to that architecture. And I think exfiltration and covert channels probably are going to be the best first examples of how IOBs can work. But this is my guess. And I'd love to hear anybody's opinion about this. I think I'm kind of all over the place. I realize that, but I'm trying to get to the point to say, hey, you got to stick it somewhere. It's got to be successful, and it can't be so dependent on a complete change of architecture in order to work, unless it's being designed for an emerging architecture that anticipates its use, so much of the data will already be there. So that's kind of the message that I was trying to get at. Okay, Patrick's got his hand up.
Yep, Patrick's sizing that.
Hey, Carter, I just finally realized where I know you from, sir. I got a drawer full of Raspberry Pis here running Argus. So thank you. Right? Thank you.
You're welcome.
to your point, I agree on those focus areas, maybe recon, uh, as well, but, I did some work with, byte outflow ratio, what I called it, bytes out over bytes in versus bytes in,
Okay.
calculating those off of, using ArcSight at that point as something off of, like 4 terabytes worth of traffic a day. And, it was very successful at identifying, anomalous activity. There were some things that we thought we had nailed down well that we didn't even realize till we started looking at that. And some of those ratios are actually specifically actionable. Something
Cool.
that's an outlier from the normal behavior, like normal DNS traffic. I mean, obviously, if the bad guys are stuffing 18 bytes in a DNS packet, that should be like sort of a red flag going off. But in any case, some of those outlier numbers were very much specifically actionable in terms of identifying some uh, very hard to find otherwise behaviors. So I think I really like the idea of of focusing on the process and the activity rather than the ephemeral indicators. Over. And again, thanks. Thank you, sir. I got it. I did a great presentation based on Argus to DoD and the DIB back in the day.
Back in the day. Well, let's see if we can't make that today or
Yeah.
next week. So no, thanks for for that very positive reaction. So, but to that end, PCR, we came up with a PCR, I think about 15 years ago. And there is in the literature, mainly in master's theses and PhD theses, it comes up a lot, but it never comes up in the general literature, if you will. Like ACM security stuff doesn't talk about those kinds of metrics. At least I haven't seen it. So
There was some work out of Scilab out of Scilab in Pittsburgh there. I'm sorry, I'm fighting the flu right now. Carnegie Mellon had some interesting stuff coming out of Scilab on C2 detection. Anyway, go ahead, sir.
yeah, sorry you're not feeling well. So, but the idea is let's just say that it's Analytic X. Analytic, and I mentioned this in the group before, Analytic X is going to require some kind of input data, and there's going to be an algorithmic sort of processing of that data, and then it's going to come up with some kind of answer that has to be compared against something. And we have to assume that, like active cyber defense, that we may have to modify sensors on the fly in order to be able to detect the new behaviors or the new indicators that have to be seen because of a zero-day phenomenon. And I think that's going to be very complicated, but I think we got to get started by trying to find an IOB messaging strategy that identifies the data type, the analytic, and the outcome, and how you can use that for detection.
Hey, Carter, I think we also have Larry Feldman wanted to chime in.
Oh, please.
So first of all, it's very impressive, and I like the presentation a lot.
Oh, great.
Second, because I'm very involved with zero trust architecture, not just from DoD side, from NCCOE, which has a lot of details. Everything about behavior is just, behavior analysis, use behavior analytics, and that's it. It just stop at that level. And this is the first time I can see how we can go deeper and how IOB can be involved. That's very, very interesting for me, and I definitely want to be involved.
Oh, great.
What I want to say, when we're talking about zero trust, everybody talking about who's supposed to use the system, how long, what to use, etc., but never ask how to use, what kind of behavior you need to provide, how to put it in our policies, or how to make it formal or something like that. And I think it's absolutely moving forward. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. So yeah, I'm really convinced that as a working group, if we're invested in this, we need to have an example that goes through the complete life cycle. And Zero Trust is about the only architecture so far that I've seen that actually has places that you can point to that says, oh, well, we'll need to do something with IOBs here, and we'll have to do something with IOBs here. Oh, and if you think you want an AI ML type of thing, well, that's got to go here. And so I'm hoping that we can put together at least one or two successful scenarios and examples for the working group. And I think CISA probably would appreciate. I mean, I don't see CISA's definition of Zero Trust as detailed as the DoD, but anything the DoD does, I know CISA will grab and want to use those as examples as well. So,
Now,
so what do you think, Charlie?
well, I had one more, comment or a question for you, Carter, with this kind of concept. I get the dynamic natures on the network. I also think that whether it's enrichment information or additional types of sensors, I think there's some non-network activity associated with identity and with activity on the endpoint
Absolutely.
is got to happen to combine with this, because I don't want to. I get the examples here were really good, but they were very network heavy, and I think that really, as we do that aggregation, it's going to be those types of disparate data types, which is what I think people push to the SIEM. But I think what you're saying is we really need to push more towards the analytic, because the SIEM isn't going to be able to scale.
Well, no, exactly. So I'm a network guy, so all of my examples are going to be network examples. But there's enough data, when you think about data generation and collection, analytics, reporting, it doesn't matter if it's UEBA type data for logins or whether it's flow data. I mean, it really doesn't matter. So you still have to do the reductions. You have to do some kind of anomaly. You have to have some guiding processes or principles to get you into some kind of, hey, this is bad versus this is good. But I think the Zero Trust, they focus first on behaviors with UEBA for, user and endpoint behavioral analytics, which I personally am not very interested in because of privacy issues and all that kind of stuff in terms of getting into individual stuff. So commercially, I see that network data is a little easier to work with than user data. But there are more companies doing user analytics than there are doing network analytics. So I think we do both, of course. But, I'm mostly in, one of the things that Zero Trust is really screaming is this non-person entity behavioral analytics, MPE.
Yes.
And I think that that's going to be a rich focus for IOBs, because that's where you get into process analytics, the notion of too much memory utilization, this non-person entity concept, and what is a behavior of an MPE, The first thing that Zero Trust wants to talk about in terms of behavioral analytics is for authentication and authorization. So this entity wants to be Carter, but he's coming at the wrong time of day, or he's coming on the wrong machine. He's not typing fast enough, or, he misspelled Carter, or who, or she, or it, right? So I think that we should have examples in all three spaces where we have human, non-person entity, and network. Or we can have system, network, and user type of strategies, and they don't all have to be similar. We should be able to come up with examples in each space where, like time of day. So there's a break-in called Staccato that was a huge impact on the government. Somebody was breaking into supercomputer centers, and the first indication of a problem was somebody noticed a time of day anomaly between a single individual's access. And so that kind of stuff should be an example because it screams at you behavioral anomaly, you know.
And our the question queue is building up. So for the
Oh,
sake of time, I want to
Daryl.
make sure we get a couple. So Daryl first, and then we got Brian Lee right afterwards. So Daryl, how you doing?
I'm well, thanks. Thanks, Charles. Yeah, this has been a really good topic. I mean, obviously, our IOV calls are always good topics. I feel like we're talking ahead of the market in a lot of ways, even around MPs. What do you think, I guess, for the group, this is really to spark conversation. UBAs, UWEBAs have been around now for quite some time, right? Not forever, but for at least for a long enough for us to say. And we've had really supposedly best of breed endpoint technologies, EDRs, and I love how you started out saying EDR, NDR, NTL, all of these categories of things that didn't exist 20 years ago that suddenly became categories. Why? Where are the gaps? Or maybe it isn't gaps. I don't know what is, but why are there so many breaches and persistent actors if endpoint data, if detection technologies are so advanced, why do you think, what are some thoughts on how these technologies are failing or falling down?
Well, I have
I'll
some
give-
response. Do you want to do that, Charles? Charlie?
Yeah, I was going to give my inflammatory response on that, which is I think some of the I think we have advanced detection capabilities with not advanced logic at its core, because we're still looking at pretty simple. I think at the very core of it, we're looking at some pretty simple behaviors.
Well, and I think everything is still that exterior to interior threat model, and the insider, where there is no malware involved. There is no knocking of ports. It's the guy knows how to log in and is going around and doing stuff. That's the most successful.
Right.
And they often know when we aren't, and they know what we aren't. Not everybody is looking very closely, and most of your more successful attackers.
I like that comment about logic. Yeah, I like that comment you made, Charles, about logic. And that's actually very seemingly accurate when you look under the covers at some of the technologies. I'm not going to name some of the UBA technologies that are still around that were early entrants. They do only look at a few vectors and try to proclaim that these vectors these are bridges that have to be crossed by all attackers. And yet they've been a part of, they've been in the security portfolio for clients who have all been breached. Like all of the biggest breaches over the last 3 years have had, 3 or 4 different key market leading technology providers that are supposedly able to stop all of these things, but they aren't. And it's not just they're not stopping them. The part that sort of I'm trying to get my head around is how can they keep proclaiming, you know what I mean? It's like a cardiothoracic surgeon and you go to him and he tells you to stop eating cheeseburgers because it's going to kill you. Or you go to a different one and he says, hey, you can eat all the cheeseburgers you want. We'll remove the cholesterol, which is essentially what these IPS and UABAs, UBAs are all saying they're doing. And yet you have all these people dying of myocardial infarctions, massive heart attacks, right?
And they can have some, and flavors of both can have elements of truth. Because I mean, kind of like what Carter was saying earlier.
Yeah.
My platform might be able to do very complex anomaly detection, but I have decided for other reasons that I'm not going to feed it 90% of the data I need for that complex anomaly detection.
Right. That's a good observation too, is that with the sprawl of tooling, there's been sort of the money put in the wrong bucket kind of problems, what I'm seeing, which is they're buying a lot of point solution, best of breed, or even in some cases, these macro or micro platform technologies. When I say micro platform, I mean it's not end-to-end comprehensive. Nothing is from any provider, but they're buying these things and then they're understaffed and they're not able to get, like you just said, all of the source intelligence they need in because they made all these tool investments. So the very data they need is hindered by the fact they spend money buying tires. Yeah.
I mean, I can't scream at everybody for why they don't, why doesn't everybody log all sysmon from all 300,000
Yes.
endpoints in their
Yeah.
instance?
So now you're seeing, I can't
There
name
are
clients,
reasons.
but yeah, I can't name clients, but I can tell you that's where everything's going from an EDR standpoint, because the leading EDR providers are all involved in all these persistent breaches. And I get it if they don't identify an attack when it happens, if it's a 0-day, but what happens when it's not a 0-day exploit, which is in a lot of cases true, and they're still not detecting it and it's persistent. How are they not detecting the persistent part, right?
Exactly. Now, I'm
So-
seeing we're about 3 minutes to the hour, and I want to make sure Brian gets.
sorry. Yeah,
Oh, no,
thank
that's
you.
okay. I'll happily stick around to continue the discussion, but I also recognize a lot of some folks that got some tight time zone constraints. So, Brian,
Okay,
it's probably
Charlie,
about
that's great.
9 minutes for you.
Can you hear me there?
We can.
Okay, that's great. Carter, really interesting presentation. Really, really cool. I enjoyed it very much. Particularly like the link up to the Zero Trust. That definitely an interesting perspective on it. I got a question which is maybe a bit unfair, and it's what does an IOB look like? Is it going to be a number, a set of numbers? Is it going to be a statistic, or all of the above, or do we know? Or some thoughts?
On this particular group, I'm a big fan of saying it's a Stix compliant JSON formatted knowledge graph.
Knowledge graph. See, those are the two interesting terms in there, Charlie, that nobody expects.
Well, at the term, I mean, at its core, Stix is the knowledge graph.
So Brian, in previous meetings, I've kind of advocated that it needs to not just be in an event with a timestamp on it and a description of what it saw. I think it also needs to have the basic metrics. It needs supporting data so that you can understand, well, what is it? So let's assume it's an anomaly detection mechanism. What did I compare this record against to tell me that this is anomalous? And the reason I need to have that data in there is so that when I receive this, I can actually do more analytics on it and come to a different conclusion or a different weighted conclusion on the indicator. But I think it's going to look like a Stix message because that's what the group is all about. But I think it's going to have a lot of basic information that is added to the event description that allows you to possibly just say, okay, thanks, I'll keep this around and wait to see what else shows up to tell me if something bad is happening.
And I'm going to use this opportunity to selfishly mention that we do keep a pretty active GitHub going with some reference implementations and are very open to pull requests and merge requests to look at some additional concepts of it as well. Just putting that out there for folks. Sorry. Go on.
Okay,
Go on, Brian and Daryl, then we have to wrap up.
I'll take it. It's a knowledge graph. The question is, what are the objects and what are the relationships? But just, I remember reading a white paper from a Finnish security group. The name escapes me right now, but they were advocating a decentralization of the anomaly detection, and they were hypothesizing to look at putting machine learning models of different kind onto the endpoints themselves. So you might have a model for file behavior, resource behavior, process behavior, user behavior, for example. And you might want to correlate the outputs from those different models to look for some behavior indication. How would the outputs of those models, I was looking at your PCR graphs there on the network behavior, and I could think that it looked like a cumulative distribution function. I'm not sure that it was, but that's what it looked like, at least.
Can be.
So I could think in terms of statistics around that curve, for example. But I could also think it could be quite a lot of other different formats. So is that any thoughts or?
Oh,
did I, does that make any sense at all? I'm just trying to think. When you think about IOC, it's fairly reasonably well defined. What, as you said, their hashes, their IP address, their URLs. There could be some kind of output from a machine learning model, or it could be anything really.
Right. I think that there are two ways of thinking about IOBs. One is that they are so over-processed that there's very little information denying that this condition exists. So the idea of chaining up lots of different kinds of indications to say this is definitely a break-in of this type. Or it's going to be an indication of something that seems innocuous or just slight change. Oh, this guy sent an extra 500 megabytes today. There's no reason to think there's anything wrong with it. There's no reason to, it's only until other information shows up later that was the event that was the problem. And so I think that IOBs are going to be across a whole range of significance. But I think
May
that
I make,
Go ahead.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
All right,
I was
Bill.
gonna make a suggestion about classification around IOBs. Is like you have infiltration, persisting, and then exfiltration. And if you can define the behaviors, the human to machine behaviors and the subsequent machine policy control activities, right? Because machines only respond by input. And then what's the subsequent path it follows, then provides the subsequent output. If you can do that and then categorize those things by, in those three areas from a process standpoint, infiltration, persistence, exfiltration, you could have, similar to MITRE, you could have these categories of behaviors that operate as more intersecting indicators, right? That you then can define parameters around.
Absolutely. And the other thing is to consider an IOB as maybe a trigger for just an analytic or a hunting process or something like that. Hey, this is something that's curious. I don't have any idea what's going on. Why don't you go look at it a little further? I think, so I see 4 or 5 different ways that IOBs fit into an automated workflow that makes them powerful, but they themselves are not specifically useful all by themselves. They have to be in conjunction with something else that either is the pre-indication or the tail end, So in most break-ins, there are 10,000 ways they could have had that initial access into the system. But once they're in the system, they're only going to do 3 or 4 things. If we tell somebody that I see one of these 3 or 4 things, then that can trigger the hunting to find the previous the initial access or just to go look for malware,
Yeah, that's
Now,
great,
since we are running,
Thank you.
since we are
I
running
think
over, go ahead. Okay, Brian, real quick. I want
Just
to
very
make sure
quickly.
Jason gets a chance.
I think it'd be really interesting to actually do a few examples. I think that'd be great.
Thanks.
We are working on it, and I'll give some summaries in the minutes. I was going to give an update on some of that, but I'll put that in the notes for today. But Jason, we're a little over the hour, so I'll need to wrap up fast, but you've had your hand up for a while. You're on mute though if you're talking.
His picture, oh, there he is.
It might just be me, but I think at least on my end, the
Yeah,
audio
it's crackling. It's crackling a little bit, quite a bit. Still
Sorry,
crackling.
Jason.
That's strange. So my program is just on the Thursday. I see I think about this and it'll continue with brainstorm is
It still sounds a little bit.
I don't think we
It's
can.
like-
I'm
It's
really
like
sorry about
AOL.
this. I don't think
It's like AOL dial-up a little bit.
all right. I'll save it for another time.
we might have to pick it
Sorry,
up on the
brother.
Slack, Jason. I'm sorry, sir.
Or can you type it in? Can you type in the question in chat? Yeah, awesome.
All righty. Well, I will keep the line on for a moment to see if we can capture that question, and get an answer to it. But I wanted to thank everybody for making it so far. And I know we're past the hour. I thank everyone for their patience. And we will be back in February with a topic to be determined, because I just got back from vacation and the heck if I know what I'm putting on our technical agenda for February yet, but there will be something. And if with that, I will stop the recording.
Thanks, Charles.
Absolutely. And we'll make sure that capture everything.